In 334 BC, a young monarch named Alexander, leading the kingdom of Macedonia, launched one of the most daring military expeditions in human history. His target, the Persian Empire, the reigning superpower of the era. Only 20 years of age, his intrepid leadership and tactical genius secured victory after victory. In a relentless decade-long odyssey that reached the boundaries of the explored world, he forged one of the most expansive empires ever seen. His presence fundamentally shifted the trajectory of civilization. While the Persians cursed him as Alexander the Accursed, the Western tradition has immortalized him as Alexander the Great. The Great Legends of History presents Alexander the Great, Part 1. Ancient Greece. Around 500 BC, this mountain-ribbed land became the cradle of unprecedented advancements in philosophy, aesthetics, and the art of war. Its two dominant powers were Athens, a maritime empire where democracy and the arts reached their zenith, and Sparta, a stern, martial society renowned for its indomitable hoplites. In 480 BC, these rival city-states allied to repel a massive invasion by the Persian Empire. At the pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek vanguard, anchored by 300 Spartans, resisted the Persian tide for 3 days before being overwhelmed. Shortly after, at the Straits of Salamis, the Greek navy crippled the Persian fleet, though they could not save the Athenian Acropolis from being put to the torch. The following year, at Plataea, the Greeks secured a final land victory, forcing the Persians to retreat for good. The ensuing 50 years marked the golden age of Greece. However, internal friction between Athens, Sparta, and their respective leagues eventually exploded into the Peloponnesian War, plunging the region into decades of fratricide. A century of constant conflict left the Greek states drained and susceptible to a rising power from the north. For generations, the civilized Greeks viewed the kingdom of Macedonia as a primitive backwater. But under King Philip II, Macedonia was transformed into a military juggernaut. His hallmark innovation was the sarissa, an 18-foot pike twice the length of the standard Greek spear, wielded by highly drilled infantry in a dense formation called the Phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip shattered the combined armies of Athens and Thebes. Through a mix of diplomacy and steel, Philip consolidated his grip on the region, forming the League of Corinth with himself as hegemon, or supreme leader. Only Sparta refused to join. Philip then set his sights on a pan-Hellenic invasion of the aging Persian Empire. But on the cusp of his great war, Philip was assassinated by his own guard, a casualty of Macedonia's lethal court politics. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Taught by the philosopher Aristotle and already an accomplished commander, Alexander was brilliant and untiring. He took up his father's mantle, but first he had to secure his throne. He eliminated internal rivals and suppressed revolts in Thessaly and Illyria. He razed the ancient city of Thebes as a warning, selling its survivors into bondage. By the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his forces across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. The greatest campaign in history had begun. Alexander's army numbered approximately 40,000, recruited from across the Greek world. The infantry fell under the command of the seasoned general Parmenio. At the core were 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, organized 16 ranks deep and bristling with the 18-foot sarissa. This iron wall was nearly invincible from the front, but lacked mobility and was weak on the flanks. To protect these gaps, 3,000 elite shield-bearers, known as hypaspists, commanded by Parmenian's son Nicanor, stood guard with shorter spears. Supporting them were 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries fighting as traditional hoplites. The Agrianes served as elite skirmishers, specialist javelin throwers from the Balkans, complemented by archers and slingers from Thrace and Illyria. The army's hammer was the companion cavalry, 1,800 aristocratic horsemen led by Philotas, another of Parmenian's sons. Alexander himself led the royal squadron into the fray. The Persian Empire was a patchwork of provinces called satrapies, each managed by a governor or satrap. As Alexander approached, the local satraps met to coordinate a defense. Memnon of Rhodes, an experienced Greek general in Persian pay, advised them to retreat and burn their crops, predicting that Alexander's army would starve. The satraps, unwilling to destroy their own lands, rejected this scorched earth plan and decided to make a stand at the river Granicus. The Persian force lined the steep banks of the 60-foot-wide river. Their front line was a massive screen of 10,000 cavalry from across the empire, Bactrians, Medes, and Hyrcanians. Their infantry, including several thousand Greek mercenaries, was held in reserve at the rear, perhaps due to lingering distrust. Alexander was determined to strike before they could reposition. On his left, he placed the Greek and Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion. In the center stood the 6 divisions of the Phalanx. On the right, Alexander took command of the companions, hypaspists, and Agrianes. Ignoring suggestions to wait for morning, Alexander ordered an immediate charge across the water. The Greeks crossed under a storm of projectiles. Upon reaching the far bank, they were met by a fierce Persian countercharge. Alexander plunged into the center of the struggle. He fought where the enemy was most concentrated, surrounded by a chaotic melee of man and horse. It was a desperate push to establish a bridgehead while the Persians fought to shove them back into the current. Alexander's boldness was a calculated risk to buy time for his phalanx to cross. During the fighting, Alexander was nearly killed. A Persian noble named Rusaces struck him on the head, shearing off part of his helmet. Alexander speared him, but a second noble, Spithridates, raised his sword to finish the king. At that moment, Black Clitus intervened, severing the Persian's arm and saving Alexander's life. With the Macedonian Phalanx now across, the Persian cavalry broke and fled. Alexander then turned his fury on the Greek mercenaries, who had not yet engaged. Viewing them as traitors to Greece, he refused their pleas for quarter and had them slaughtered. Asia Minor was now open, but the true test lay ahead. King Darius III was mobilizing the full might of the Persian Empire. Alexander marched to Sardis, which surrendered immediately. To secure his rear, he moved to dismantle Persian naval influence by capturing their Mediterranean bases. Miletus and Halicarnassus were taken after difficult sieges. By 333 BC, he moved into Phrygia. At Gordium, he confronted the famous Gordian knot. Legend said the man who untied it would rule Asia. Alexander simply drew his blade and cut it through. The Battle of Issus. 18 months into the invasion, Alexander moved towards Syria. However, Darius managed to bring his main army behind the Greeks, cutting their supply lines. Darius chose a narrow coastal plain near Issus, roughly 6 miles wide, to trap Alexander. While the terrain limited Darius's 2-to-1 numerical advantage, his force of 100,000 was still daunting, including the elite Immortals, and thousands of Greek mercenaries. Alexander mirrored his usual deployment, Parmenion on the left by the sea, the Phalanx in the middle, and Alexander with the companions on the right near the mountains. Darius waited behind the Pinarus River, Alexander, riding along his lines to inspire his men, ordered the attack. The Macedonian right wing smashed into the Persian line, but the center phalanx struggled to maintain formation while crossing the river and was pushed back by Darius's mercenaries. Seeing the crisis, Alexander swung his cavalry into the Persian center, aiming directly for Darius. Threatened on their flank, the mercenaries faltered. Faced with the sight of the charging Macedonian king, Darius lost his nerve and fled in his chariot. As word of the king's flight spread, the Persian army collapsed. The retreat turned into a slaughter. The dead were so numerous that the Macedonians reportedly used the bodies to bridge deep ravines. Issus was a total victory. Among the captives were Darius's mother, wife, and children, whom Alexander treated with high honor. He then turned to Phoenicia to neutralize the Persian fleet. While most cities submitted, the island fortress of Tyre defied him. Alexander spent 7 months building a massive causeway and siege towers to reach the city. When the walls finally crumbled, Tyre was brutally sacked. Gaza fell next. In 332 BC, Alexander entered Egypt. The Persians surrendered without a fight, and the Egyptians hailed him as a liberator, crowning him pharaoh at Memphis. He founded the city of Alexandria at the Nile's mouth and ventured to the Siwah oasis. There, the oracle reportedly greeted him as the son of Amun, the king of the gods. By 331 BC, Alexander returned to Tyre, where news arrived of a Spartan revolt led by King Accursed III. Alexander's regent in Greece, Antipater, marched south and crushed the Spartans at Megalopolis, killing Agis. With Greece pacified, Alexander marched toward the Persian heartland. Darius sent a letter offering half his empire, a massive ransom, and his daughter's hand in marriage for peace. Alexander, now believing himself destined for world dominion, refused. He didn't want a portion of the empire. He intended to take it all. In 331 BC, the two kings met for a final showdown near Gaugamela. Darius had meticulously leveled the battlefield to favor his superior numbers and his scythed chariots. His army, ranging from 50,000 to 80,000, included diverse units from India to Babylonia, plus war elephants. Alexander, though outnumbered 2-1, deployed with his flanks angled back to prevent encirclement. The battle began with a strange move. Alexander led his right wing further to the right. The Persians shifted to mirror him, creating a gap in their own line. This was the trap. Darius unleashed his chariots, but the Agranese javelin men picked off the drivers, and the infantry opened ranks to let the chariots pass through harmlessly. Alexander then led a wedge of companion cavalry straight into the opening in the Persian center, charging toward Darius. Once again, panic seized the Persian king, and he fled. The battle wasn't over, however. Parmenion's left wing was being overwhelmed and sent a desperate plea for aid. Alexander halted his pursuit of Darius and turned back to rescue his general. After the bloodiest fighting of the day, the Persian right wing finally disintegrated. Gaugamela was the decisive blow. The path to Babylon was open. Alexander entered the capital as a conqueror and took his seat on the Persian throne at Susa. He forced his way through the Persian gates in the Zagros Mountains and reached Persepolis in 330 BC. Though he claimed to be the rightful successor, Alexander ordered the ceremonial capital to be burned. a symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander then pursued Darius toward Ecbatana, but the fugitive king was betrayed and murdered by his own satrap, Bessus. Alexander, showing respect to his fallen rival, sent Darius's body to be buried in the royal tombs. Now, Alexander set his sights on the usurper Bessus and the uncharted lands of the east. Alexander's march continued into what is now Afghanistan. He crushed a revolt in Arya and founded Alexandria Ariana, modern Herat. But as the campaign dragged on, tension rose within his own ranks. Many Macedonians resented his adoption of Persian dress and court rituals, which they saw as decadent. In Frada, a conspiracy to kill Alexander was discovered. Philotas, commander of the cavalry, was implicated for failing to report the plot. Under torture, he confessed and was executed. Alexander then sent agents to kill Philotas's father, the loyal general Parmenion, to prevent a retaliatory revolt. In 329 BC, Alexander captured Bessus and sent him to be executed as a regicide. He pushed into Tajikistan, founding Alexandria Eshate, the furthest. He defeated the nomadic Scythians in a decisive battle at the Jaxartes River, but found himself bogged down in a grueling guerrilla war against local tribes. His growing paranoia and ego led to tragedy. During a drunken feast in Samarkand, Alexander quarreled with Black Clitus, the man who had saved his life at Granicus. In a fit of rage, Alexander killed him with a spear. Remorse followed, but the damage to his reputation was done. His attempt to enforce proskynesis, the Persian act of prostration, was rejected by the Greeks as blasphemy, and he was forced to relent. After surviving another plot by his royal pages, Alexander married the Bactrian noblewoman Roxana in 327 BC. It was a strategic union that helped pacify the region and allowed him to turn his attention toward the Indus Valley and India. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush and fought a series of brutal mountain sieges, including the capture of Masaga. In 326 BC, he faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. It was his most grueling victory. The Persian war elephants caused horrific casualties among the Macedonians. Though victorious, the cost was high. Alexander intended to push deeper into India, seeking the Great Ocean at the world's edge. But at the river Hyphasis, his army finally broke. After 8 years and thousands of miles, the men mutinied, refusing to face the massive Indian armies rumored to lie ahead. Furious but powerless, Alexander turned back. The return journey was a nightmare. They followed the rivers to the coast, where Alexander was nearly killed by an arrow to the chest during the siege of a Malian town. Upon reaching the sea, he split his force. Nearchus led the fleet through the Persian Gulf in a landmark voyage of discovery, while Alexander led the remainder through the brutal Gedrosian desert. Thousands perished from heat and thirst. Upon his return to Susa in 324 BC, Alexander executed several governors for corruption. He staged a mass wedding of Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen to unify his empire and paid off his soldiers' debts. However, another mutiny broke out at Opis over his perceived favoritism of Persians. Only an emotional speech and reconciliation restored order. Then, tragedy struck again. His closest companion, Hephaestion, died of a fever in Ecbatana. Alexander was devastated, ordering an empire-wide period of mourning. He led a final campaign against the Kosaean mountain tribes before returning to Babylon. In June 323 BC, while planning a maritime invasion of Arabia, Alexander fell ill with a sudden fever. He died days later at the age of 32. The exact cause, malaria, typhoid, or poison, remains a subject of eternal debate. Alexander died without losing a single battle. He left behind a vast, fragile empire and no clear heir. His generals immediately began a series of bloody wars to carve out their own kingdoms. In the chaos, his wife Roxana and his young son Alexander IV were murdered. His golden sarcophagus was hijacked and eventually taken to Alexandria, Egypt, where its final resting place remains a mystery. Alexander's life signaled the start of the Hellenistic Age, Greek culture fused with local traditions across Asia and Africa, sparking revolutions in science, art, and governance. His successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Persia, lasted for centuries until they were eventually eclipsed by the rising shadow of Rome. Few figures have left a footprint as deep as Alexander the Great. He was a man of contradictions, a brilliant strategist, a visionary leader, and a ruthless conqueror whose legend continues to echo through the halls of history. Thank you for watching The Great Legends of History. Special thanks to our patrons and researchers for making this series possible.